Hello, everyone. The first signs were small, almost unnoticeable. At first, I thought Claire was just tired or maybe coming down with something. She had been working late, her job at the marketing firm demanding more of her time with the new project she had been assigned. I didn't think much of it when she started complaining of fatigue, or when she seemed unusually moody. We had been married for 5 years, and in that time, we'd weathered our fair share of ups and downs. But this felt different. The warmth that once radiated between us had cooled, replaced by a distance I couldn't quite explain. It started with her cravings. I came home one night to find her eating pickles straight from the jar, something she had never done before. I laughed it off at first, making a joke about pregnancy cravings, but her reaction wasn't what I expected. She froze, her face going pale as she quickly put the jar away and mumbled something about a weird craving she couldn't shake. "Claire, are you feeling okay?" I asked, genuinely concerned. "You seem off lately." She forced a smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine, just tired. Work has been stressful." I wanted to believe her, but there was a gnawing feeling in my gut that wouldn't go away. The more I observed, the more I noticed. She avoided eye contact, her laughter came less often, and when it did, it felt forced. She spent more time on her phone, her screen always angled away from me when I walked into the room. And then there were the nights she claimed to be too tired or had a headache, retreating to bed early, leaving me alone in the living room, staring at the flickering light of the TV. The weeks passed, and Claire's behavior only became more erratic. She started wearing loose clothing, which wasn't unusual considering the cold weather, but it seemed almost deliberate, as if she was trying to hide something. One morning, I noticed her staring at herself in the mirror, her hand resting lightly on her stomach. She quickly moved her hand away when she noticed me watching. "Are you sure you're okay?" I asked again, this time with more urgency. She nodded, avoiding my gaze. "I'm fine, really. Just a little off lately. Probably just stress." But I wasn't convinced. I knew my wife, or at least I thought I did. This wasn't just stress, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I suggested she see a doctor, but she brushed it off, saying it was just a stomach bug or that she was just tired from all the work stress. One evening, after weeks of this strange behavior, Claire finally broke down. She was in the bathroom for what seemed like an eternity, and when she finally emerged, her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. "Claire, what's going on?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. She looked at me with a mixture of fear and guilt. "I don't know," she whispered. "I just don't feel like myself. Maybe you should see a doctor," I suggested gently, trying not to push her too hard. She shook her head vehemently. "No, it's nothing. I'll be fine. I just need to rest." But her behavior only got worse. She started canceling plans, avoiding our friends, and spending more time locked away in our bedroom. I felt helpless, watching her spiral into what I thought was some kind of depression. But there was something more, something she wasn't telling me. Then, one day, I came home early from work and found her sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the wall. She didn't even notice me come in. I sat down next to her and took her hand in mine. "Claire, I'm really worried about you," I said softly. She finally looked at me, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm scared, James. I don't know what's happening to me." I wrapped my arms around her, holding her as she cried. "We'll get through this together," I promised, even though I had no idea what it was. I suggested the doctor again, and this time, she didn't refuse outright, but she also didn't agree. As the days passed, Claire's condition seemed to worsen. She became increasingly secretive, hiding things from me, like her phone and her schedule. One night, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, staring down at a small object in her hand. When she saw me, she quickly shoved it into her pocket, but I had already seen enough. It was a pregnancy test. My heart dropped. The room seemed to spin around me as I processed what I had just seen. But I didn't say anything. Not yet. I wanted to hear it from her, to understand what was going on. Maybe she was afraid, Or maybe there was something more to this that I didn't understand. That night, I lay in bed next to her, listening to her breathing, my mind racing with a million thoughts. If she was pregnant, why hadn't she told me? Why was she hiding it? And more importantly, whose baby was it? The next morning, I confronted her gently, not wanting to scare her off. Claire, I saw the test. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. It's not what you think, she said quickly. Then what is it? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. She hesitated, tears welling up in her eyes. I don't know. I'm so scared, James. I don't know what's happening. Is it positive? I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. She nodded slowly, and I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. But I still didn't know the truth, and I wasn't ready to jump to conclusions. Not yet. Claire, we need to go to the doctor, I said firmly. We need to figure out what's going on. She looked like she wanted to argue, but then she nodded again, her shoulders slumping in defeat. Okay, she whispered. But please, James, don't hate me. I held her close, trying to ignore the growing pit in my stomach. I could never hate you, I lied, trying to reassure her and myself at the same time. But deep down, I knew that whatever was going on was going to change everything. The next morning felt like walking through quicksand. Everything seemed to drag, as if the weight of the world had descended on our home. Claire was quiet, more than usual, and I could see the worry etched into every line of her face. The woman I married, who once brightened any room she entered, now seemed like a ghost haunting the very walls of our house. And I was the one desperately chasing the truth. We drove to the clinic in silence, the tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife. My mind was a storm of conflicting emotions: anger, fear, suspicion, but also an irrational hope that this was all just a misunderstanding. Yet, deep down, I knew that hope was slipping away with every passing minute. Claire's hands trembled as she signed in at the reception desk. I wanted to ask her 1,000 questions, but I knew now wasn't the time. Instead, I just held her hand, trying to offer what little comfort I could. As we sat in the waiting room, I noticed how she kept glancing around, her eyes darting to the door as if she were contemplating escape. My heart tightened. What was she so afraid of? Finally, we were called in. The doctor, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, greeted us warmly, but I barely registered her words. My focus was on Claire, who seemed to shrink under the fluorescent lights of the examination room. The doctor asked her routine questions, and Claire answered with short, clipped responses. Then came the moment of truth. Would you like an ultrasound today to confirm everything? The doctor asked. Claire tensed, her eyes flicking toward me for a brief second before she shook her head. No, I don't think that's necessary, she stammered. The doctor frowned slightly, clearly confused by Claire's reluctance. It's important to make sure everything is progressing as it should. There's no harm in checking. I could see the panic rising in Claire's eyes, and that was it for me. I couldn't stand the evasions, the half-truths, the fear in her voice. Yes, I interjected firmly. We need to do this. Claire looked at me, her eyes pleading, but I wasn't backing down. There was too much at stake now. Please, Claire, I said softly, trying to keep my voice steady. We need to know. She hesitated for what felt like an eternity, then finally, she gave a small nod, resigning herself to the inevitable. The doctor prepared the equipment, and I watched as Claire lay back on the examination table, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, her hands clenched into fists. As the doctor began the ultrasound, I held my breath, the tension in the room palpable. The screen flickered to life, and there it was, the unmistakable shape of a tiny, growing life. My heart should have soared at the sight, but instead, it plummeted. This should have been a moment of joy, of shared happiness, but all I felt was dread. The doctor smiled, clearly pleased with what she saw. Everything looks good. You're about 12 weeks along. Congratulations. I glanced at Claire, expecting to see relief or maybe even a hint of joy, but instead, her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She knew, just as I did, that this child couldn't be mine. We hadn't been intimate in months, not since before all of this started. And then, like a punch to the gut, the realization hit me. 12 weeks. That was roughly around the time when her behavior began to change, when she started acting distant and secretive. The ride home was suffocating, the silence between us louder than any argument we could have had. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but I couldn't. Not yet. I needed to keep my composure, to figure out what to do next. That night, as we lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. Who was the father? How long had this been going on? Why hadn't she told me? I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me, but I knew I had to keep it under control. I needed to play this carefully, to uncover the truth without letting on that I knew. Claire was asleep, or at least pretending to be, her breathing slow and even. I slipped out of bed and quietly made my way to the living room. I needed space to think, to plan. There was a rage building inside me, something primal, something I had never felt before. But alongside the anger was a cold, calculating part of me that knew I needed to be smart about this. I thought about the men in Claire's life, her colleagues, her friends, the people she spent time with when she wasn't with me. Was it someone from work? A neighbor? The questions circled in my mind, but there were no answers. Not yet. I knew what I had to do. I needed proof. Confronting her now would only drive her further into her shell, and I couldn't afford that. I needed to know the whole story before I made any decisions. The next day, I called in sick to work. Claire had already left for the office, so I had the house to myself. I started with her phone, searching through her messages and call logs, but everything seemed normal. Too normal. Almost as if it had been cleaned up. But then, I found something, a hidden messaging app buried among the other apps, one I had never seen her use before. I opened it, and my blood ran cold. There were messages, hundreds of them from several different men. My hands trembled as I read through them, the words blurring as my vision darkened with rage. Flirting, secret meetings, and worse, explicit exchanges that made my stomach turn. But the worst part was the dates. They matched up perfectly with the timeline of her pregnancy. It was like a knife twisting in my gut. Claire, the woman I had loved and trusted, had betrayed me in the worst possible way. And not just once, but multiple times, with multiple men. The evidence was there, right in front of me, undeniable and devastating. I sat there for hours, reading every message, memorizing every detail. By the time I finished, I felt like a hollow shell, the life drained out of me. But I couldn't break down now. I needed to stay strong, to figure out my next move. One thing was clear: this wasn't just a betrayal. It was a calculated, deliberate act of deceit. And I wasn't going to let it go unanswered. I needed to find out who these men were, and I needed to make them pay. But first, I needed to confront Claire. Not directly, not yet. I had to keep the upper hand, to make sure she didn't see what was coming. I was going to play the role of the loving, supportive husband until the time was right. And then I would strike. The following days were a blur, a hazy mess of forced smiles and quiet observations. Every moment with Claire felt like a chess game, each move calculated and deliberate, my emotions carefully masked behind a facade of calm. She continued her routine, oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath the surface. But I could see it now, the little signs I had missed before. The quick glances at her phone, the way she avoided certain topics, the way she seemed on edge whenever I was around. It was like watching a stranger live in my wife's skin. I played my part well. Every morning, I kissed her on the cheek, told her I loved her, and sent her off to work. Every evening, I pretended to be interested in her day, asking the usual questions, making the usual comments. She seemed relieved by my apparent acceptance of her situation, as if she had feared I might push for answers. But I didn't. Not yet. I needed more time, more information. At night, while she slept, I continued my investigation. The hidden app had been a goldmine of information, but it had only scratched the surface. I began to look deeper, searching through her emails, her social media accounts, and anything else I could access. It was a painstaking process, but I was methodical, determined not to miss a single detail. What I found confirmed my worst fears. There were more men than I had initially thought, 3, maybe 4. Each one had his own role in her twisted web of lies. There were affectionate messages, promises of secret rendezvous, and thinly veiled plans to meet up while I was at work. It was sickening, but it was also exactly what I needed. I noted their names, their locations, and anything else that could help me identify them. They were no longer faceless shadows in my mind, they were targets. Despite the burning anger inside me, I knew I couldn't let it consume me. I had to stay calm, keep my head clear. This wasn't just about punishing Claire, this was about taking back control of my life. About making sure those responsible felt the full weight of what they had done. Revenge was an ugly word, but it was the only one that fit. They had taken something from me, something irreplaceable, and I wasn't going to let them walk away unscathed. One night, as Claire lay asleep beside me, I began to formulate a plan. I knew where to start at the source. The first man, the one she had been in contact with the longest, worked in the same building as her. I had seen his name in several of their exchanges, often disguised as work-related messages. I knew his schedule, his habits, and his weaknesses. He was my entry point, the beginning of the end for all of them. The next day, I set my plan into motion. I took a day off work, under the pretense of running errands, and instead followed Claire to her office. I parked a safe distance away, watching as she entered the building, oblivious to my presence. I waited for an hour, watching the flow of people, studying their faces, until I saw him, Matt, the first of her lovers. He was tall, with dark hair and an easy smile, the kind of guy who looked like he belonged on the cover of a magazine. But I wasn't interested in his looks. I was interested in his routine. He left the building around noon, just as I had expected. He walked to a nearby cafe, where he grabbed lunch alone. I followed him inside, keeping my distance, careful not to draw attention. He sat at a table by the window, scrolling through his phone, completely unaware that he was being watched. My pulse quickened as I approached, but I forced myself to stay calm. I wasn't going to confront him here, not yet. This was just reconnaissance, a way to familiarize myself with my enemy. As I observed him, I noticed little details: how he carried himself, the way he interacted with the staff, the casual way he flirted with the waitress. It was clear that he was used to getting what he wanted, and that made him dangerous. But it also made him predictable. Men like him had patterns, habits they couldn't break. And that was where I would find my advantage. I left the cafe before he did, satisfied with what I had learned. There was still more work to do, but I was beginning to see the shape of my plan. I knew I couldn't rush this. Each step had to be precise, each move carefully calculated. I needed to find their vulnerabilities, their weaknesses, and exploit them to my advantage. Over the next few days, I began to put my plan into action. I continued my surveillance, tracking Matt's movements, learning his schedule. I studied his interactions with Claire, noting the times they met, the places they went. I was always one step behind, but that was exactly where I wanted to be. The key was to stay invisible, to keep them unaware of the net slowly closing in around them. At home, I maintained the charade of normalcy. Claire seemed more relaxed, believing that the worst was over, that I had accepted the situation. She was wrong. I was simply biding my time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Every time I looked at her, I felt the anger bubbling up inside me, but I forced it down, knowing that the time would come when I could unleash it fully. Then, one evening, the opportunity presented itself. Claire had gone to bed early, complaining of a headache, and I was left alone with my thoughts. I poured myself a drink, sat down at the kitchen table, and began to lay out the final stages of my plan. I knew where Matt would be the next day, and I knew he would be alone. It was the perfect opportunity, one I couldn't afford to miss. The next morning, I kissed Claire goodbye as usual, telling her I had a meeting in the city. In reality, I was heading straight for Matt's office. I parked in the same spot as before, waited for him to leave, and followed him to the cafe. This time, I didn't keep my distance. I walked right up to him, my heart pounding in my chest. "Mind if I join you?" I asked, my voice calm and controlled. Matt looked up, surprised, but he smiled politely. "Sure, no problem. Do I know you?" I smiled back, my expression cold. "Not yet, but you will." As I sat down across from him, I could see the confusion in his eyes, the slight unease in his posture. He didn't know who I was or why I was there, but he would soon enough. I leaned in, lowering my voice so only he could hear. "I know about you and Claire," I said quietly, watching as his smile faltered. The color drained from his face, and I knew I had him. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, but the fear in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. I leaned back, keeping my voice steady, my gaze locked on his. "You're going to end it. Today. You're going to tell her it's over, that you made a mistake. And then you're going to disappear. If you don't, I'll make sure everyone at your office knows exactly what you've been up to. I'll ruin you, Matt." He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He knew I wasn't bluffing, and that was enough. After a long moment, he nodded, his hands trembling as he reached for his phone. "Good," I said, standing up. "Remember, Matt? This is just the beginning." I left him there, a broken man in a broken cafe, knowing that this was only the first step. There were more men who had betrayed me, who had taken something that didn't belong to them. And I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The first taste of revenge was intoxicating. Watching Matt crumble under the weight of his guilt was a small victory, a crack in the foundation of the lies that had been built around me. But it wasn't enough. One man down, but there were still others, and each of them had played their part in the betrayal. I had to keep going. I had to see this through to the bitter end. At home, Claire remained blissfully ignorant, unaware that the web of deceit she had spun was slowly unraveling. She even seemed more at ease, perhaps thinking that her secret was safe, that her life had returned to some semblance of normalcy. Little did she know that the storm was only beginning. The following morning, I watched as Claire left for work, her smile faint but genuine. It was a smile I had once loved, but now it only served to remind me of the betrayal that lay beneath. As soon as she was out of sight, I set my plan into motion. There were still other men who needed to be dealt with, and I wasn't going to stop until each one of them felt the same fear that had gripped Matt. The next target was easier to track. Tom was a colleague of Claire's, someone she had mentioned in passing a few times. I had always thought nothing of it, just another name in the list of people she worked with. But now, I saw him for what he really was, a snake in the grass, hiding behind the facade of a friendly coworker. His messages to Claire were less frequent but no less damning. They spoke of late nights at the office, of stolen moments in empty conference rooms. He was just as guilty as the others, and he would pay for it. I found Tom easily enough. He was a creature of habit, following the same routine every day. He stopped by a gym on his way to work, an expensive place downtown where the city's well-to-do sweated out their sins before facing another day. I waited for him outside, my car parked across the street. My heart pounded in my chest, the same mix of anger and adrenaline that had fueled my confrontation with Matt. But this time, I felt a deeper resolve, a sense of righteousness in what I was about to do. Tom emerged from the gym, looking every bit the successful professional, tall, fit, and confident. He had no idea that his life was about to take a turn he wouldn't see coming. I let him get to his car before I approached, keeping my expression neutral, my steps measured. "Tom," I called out as he unlocked his car. He turned, surprise flashing in his eyes as he saw me. "Yes? Do I know you?" I stepped closer, making sure there was no mistaking the seriousness of my tone. "Not personally, but you know my wife, Claire." Recognition flickered in his eyes, quickly followed by the same nervousness I had seen in Matt. "Oh, right. Claire. What can I do for you? I think you know exactly what you can do," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "You're going to end whatever it is you think you have with her. Now. Today." Tom glanced around, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. Look, man, I don't know what you're talking about. Claire and I are just friends, nothing more. Don't lie to me. I snapped, my patience wearing thin. I've seen the messages. I know what you've been doing. It ends today, or I'll make sure everyone in your life knows exactly what kind of man you are. Tom's face paled, the bravado quickly fading. He was caught, and he knew it. Okay, he muttered, raising his hands in surrender. I'll end it. I'll tell her it's over. Good, I said, stepping back. And one more thing, if I ever see you near her again, I won't be as forgiving. He nodded, visibly shaken, and quickly got into his car. As he drove away, I watched him go, the anger inside me still simmering. It was another small victory, another piece of the puzzle falling into place. But it still wasn't enough. There were more men, more secrets to uncover. The third man was different. Unlike Matt and Tom, he wasn't a colleague or a casual fling. His name was Luke, and from what I could gather, he was someone Claire had known for a long time, possibly even before we were married. His messages were more personal, more intimate, filled with references to shared memories and inside jokes. It was clear that their relationship went deeper than the others, and that made him the most dangerous of all. I needed to approach Luke differently. He wasn't going to be intimidated by a simple confrontation. He was the kind of man who would push back, who would try to turn the tables if he felt cornered. I had to be smarter, more strategic. I spent the next few days gathering information on him. He lived in a small apartment on the other side of town, a place that was far too modest for someone who seemed to think so highly of himself. He worked as a freelance photographer, which explained the irregular hours and the frequent travel that Claire had mentioned in passing. His life was chaotic, filled with spur-of-the-moment decisions and spontaneous plans. But there was one thing that remained constant: his attachment to Claire. I waited for the right moment, biding my time as I watched him from a distance. I needed to catch him off guard, to make sure he didn't have time to think or react. And then, one evening, the opportunity presented itself. Luke had just returned from a trip, his car pulling into the parking lot of his apartment building. He was alone, his apartment dark and empty. It was the perfect moment to strike. I approached him as he was unloading his bags from the trunk of his car. He didn't notice me at first, too preoccupied with his own thoughts. But when he finally looked up and saw me standing there, he froze. "Luke," I said, my voice steady. "We need to talk." He straightened up, his eyes narrowing as he sized me up. "Do I know you? You know my wife, Claire," I replied, my words cutting through the tension like a knife. Recognition dawned on his face, followed by a slight smirk. He wasn't afraid, not like the others. That made him dangerous, but it also made him predictable. He was going to try and play this off, to make me doubt what I already knew. "What about her?" he asked casually, leaning against the car. "I know about you too," I said, keeping my tone calm. "I know what's been going on, and I'm here to tell you that it ends now." Luke didn't flinch. Instead, he crossed his arms, a faint smile playing on his lips. "And if I say no?" I stepped closer, my voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Then I make sure everyone knows who you really are. I'll destroy your reputation, your career, everything you've built. You might think you can handle it, but you can't." For a moment, we stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills. I could see the calculation in his eyes, the wheels turning in his head as he weighed his options. But I had the upper hand, and he knew it. "Fine," he said finally, his voice tinged with resentment. "It's over. But don't think this means you've won. Claire's going to do whatever she wants, no matter what you say." I didn't respond. Instead, I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, defeated but still defiant. I knew he wasn't going to give up easily, but that didn't matter. The wheels were already in motion, and there was no stopping what was coming. At home, Claire seemed unaware of the storm brewing around her. She went about her routine, blissfully ignorant of the confrontations that had taken place. But I could see the cracks starting to show. She was more distant, more guarded, as if she sensed that something was wrong but couldn't quite put her finger on it. I watched her closely, waiting for the moment when the truth would finally come crashing down around her. That night, as we lay in bed, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. I was getting closer to the truth, closer to the point where everything would be revealed. But with that truth came the realization that my life would never be the same. The woman I had loved, the life we had built together, it was all a lie, a facade that was crumbling faster than I could control. But I couldn't stop now. I had to see this through, no matter the cost. There was still one more piece of the puzzle, one final confrontation that had to take place. And when it was over, the truth would finally be out in the open, and the real consequences would begin. The days that followed were filled with a tense silence, like the calm before a storm. Claire continued to act as though everything was normal, but I could sense her growing unease. She seemed to sense that something was off, though she couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. It was only a matter of time before the walls she had built around her lies would come crashing down. I had dealt with Matt, Tom, and Luke, each confrontation bringing me closer to the truth. But there was still one final piece of the puzzle: a man named Ethan. His name had come up less frequently in the messages I found, but his interactions with Claire were different from the others. They were more sporadic, more intense, as if he was someone who only appeared when it was convenient, or when something specific was needed. He was the outlier, the one who didn't fit neatly into the patterns of the others, and that made him the most dangerous. Ethan was harder to track down. He wasn't tied to a regular schedule like the others. He moved around a lot, often out of town for extended periods. I suspected he was some kind of consultant or freelancer, someone who worked when and where he was needed. It took days of careful planning and observation before I finally figured out his pattern. He would be back in town at the end of the week, staying at a hotel downtown. It was the perfect opportunity, and I wasn't going to let it slip by. The day Ethan was set to arrive, I made my move. I took the day off work, telling Claire I had some errands to run. She didn't question me, perhaps too absorbed in her own world to notice the change in my demeanor. As soon as she left for the office, I prepared for the confrontation. This was the final piece of the puzzle, the last man who had a hand in destroying my life. I arrived at the hotel early, blending in with the morning crowd as I waited in the lobby. My heart pounded with a mix of anticipation and dread. This confrontation felt different from the others. There was a finality to it, as if everything that had happened was leading up to this moment. I had to be careful, precise. I couldn't afford any mistakes. Ethan arrived right on schedule, wheeling a suitcase behind him as he checked in. He looked ordinary, nothing like the type of man I would have expected to be involved in such a tangled web. But that was the point, wasn't it? He was just another man in a suit, another face in the crowd, someone who could slip in and out of people's lives without leaving a trace. I followed him up to his room, keeping a safe distance. When he reached his door, I made my move. "Ethan," I called out, my voice steady. He turned, surprised, but didn't seem alarmed. "Yes? Can I help you?" I approached him calmly, my heart racing. "We need to talk. It's about Claire." His expression changed, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Who are you?" he asked, his tone suddenly guarded. "I'm her husband," I replied, watching as the realization dawned on him. "And I know everything." For a moment, he didn't respond, his eyes narrowing as he tried to gauge the situation. Then, he did something I didn't expect. He laughed, a short, bitter sound. "So you figured it out, huh? Took you long enough." His reaction caught me off guard, but I quickly recovered. "It's over, Ethan. Whatever you had with her, it ends now." Ethan shook his head, a smirk playing on his lips. "You really think it's that simple? You have no idea what you're dealing with, do you?" His arrogance infuriated me, but I forced myself to stay calm. "You're going to end it, or I'll make sure you regret ever meeting her. Is that so?" he replied, crossing his arms. "And what makes you think you can do that?" I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "Because I'm not like the others. I know what you all are. And I'm not going to let you get away with it." For a moment, Ethan just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, He opened the door to his room and stepped inside, leaving the door ajar. "Come on in," he said over his shoulder. "Let's talk." I hesitated, but my need for answers pushed me forward. I followed him into the room, my senses on high alert. The room was neat and personal, with no sign of the man who had just walked in. Ethan tossed his suitcase onto the bed and turned to face me, his expression now serious. "You want to know the truth?" he asked, his tone surprisingly calm. "Fine. I'll tell you." I crossed my arms, waiting. "I'm listening." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Claire and I, we go way back. Before she met you, even. We've always had this thing, this connection. It was never supposed to be serious, just a bit of fun on the side. But she never let go." "What do you mean?" I demanded, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. "She kept coming back," he continued, his voice tinged with regret. "Even after she married you, she couldn't stay away. She'd call me, meet me when she was in town. I told her it was over, more than once, but she wouldn't listen. She kept saying she loved you, but she couldn't let go of me." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just some casual fling, some one-time mistake. This was something deeper, something that had been going on for years. My mind raced as I tried to process what he was saying. "You're lying," I said, though the conviction in my voice was starting to waver. "I wish I was," Ethan replied, his tone sincere. "I didn't want to be involved in this. I tried to end it, but Claire, she wouldn't let me. She was obsessed, James. She kept coming back to me, even when I told her not to." I felt like the floor was falling out from under me. Everything I thought I knew, everything I had pieced together, was starting to crumble. I wanted to scream, to lash out, but I couldn't. I had to stay in control, to get through this without losing my mind. "So what now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan looked at me, his expression softening. Now, you do what you need to do. But trust me, James, this isn't just about revenge. You need to ask yourself if you can live with what you find." His words hung in the air, a chilling warning that sent a shiver down my spine. I had come here for answers, but now that I had them, I wasn't sure if I could handle the truth. I had spent so long focusing on the lies, the betrayal, that I hadn't stopped to think about what would happen once the truth was finally revealed. I left Ethan's room in a daze, his words echoing in my mind. I had thought I was ready for this, that I could handle whatever came next. But now, I wasn't so sure. The final confrontation was looming, and with it, the reality of what my life had become. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was teetering on the edge of something dark, something I might not be able to come back from. I had spent so long hunting down the truth, but now that it was within reach, I wasn't sure if I wanted it anymore. When I arrived home, Claire was waiting for me, a smile on her face that quickly faded when she saw my expression. "James? What's wrong?" I looked at her, the woman I had loved for so many years, and for the first time, I didn't know how to respond. The mask was slipping, the truth was clawing its way to the surface, and I didn't know if I could stop it. "Nothing," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just tired. It's been a long day." She seemed to accept that, but the worry in her eyes remained. As we went through our evening routine, I felt like I was moving through a dream, disconnected from reality. The truth was there, just beneath the surface, waiting to be revealed. But once it was out, there would be no going back. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I realized that the final confrontation was inevitable. I couldn't keep this up much longer. The time had come to face Claire, to confront her with everything I had learned, and to deal with the consequences. But as the darkness closed in around me, I couldn't help but wonder, was I really ready to face the truth? The night dragged on, every minute stretching into an eternity as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The weight of everything I had discovered pressed down on me, suffocating and relentless. The truth was finally within reach, but instead of bringing clarity, it had only deepened the darkness. I knew what I had to do, but that didn't make it any easier. The confrontation I had been avoiding for so long was now inevitable. Morning arrived with the same dull routine, but this time, there was a sense of finality in the air. Claire moved around the house with a strange kind of nervous energy, as if she could sense that something was about to happen. I watched her closely, every gesture, every look she gave me, filled with a new significance. This was the woman I had loved, the woman I had built a life within, the woman who had betrayed me in the worst possible way. After breakfast, I knew it was time. I couldn't put it off any longer. As Claire cleared the dishes, I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. "Claire," I said, my voice steady but cold. "We need to talk." She froze, the plate she was holding slipping from her fingers and shattering on the floor. Her face went pale, her eyes wide with fear. She knew. She knew this moment was coming, and now that it was here, there was no escaping it. "What is it, James?" she asked, her voice trembling as she turned to face me. I motioned for her to sit down at the kitchen table. She hesitated, then slowly complied, her hands shaking as she sat across from me. I could see the fear in her eyes, the guilt written across her face. She wasn't going to be able to talk her way out of this. "I know everything," I began, keeping my voice even despite the rage simmering just beneath the surface. "I know about Matt, Tom, Luke, and Ethan." Her breath hitched, and she looked down at the table, unable to meet my gaze. "James, don't," I interrupted, my tone harsh. "Don't try to explain it away. Don't lie to me. I've seen the messages, Claire. I know what you've been doing behind my back." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't let it sway me. I had to stay strong, to see this through to the end. "Why, Claire? Why did you do it?" She shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know. I was lonely, James. You were always working, always busy. I needed something more." "More?" I echoed, incredulous. "You needed more, so you went out and slept with half a dozen men? You destroyed our marriage, our life, because you were lonely?" Her tears spilled over, and she reached out as if to take my hand, but I pulled back, disgusted. "James, please," she begged, her voice breaking. "I never meant for it to go this far. It just happened, I repeated, my anger flaring. "No, Claire. This didn't just happen. You made a choice to betray me, to lie to me, to keep this from me for years," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "I'm so sorry, James. I'm so sorry." But her apologies felt hollow, empty. They couldn't erase the pain she had caused, the damage she had done. "Is the baby mine?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Her silence was answer enough. The room seemed to close in around me, the air thick with the weight of the truth. I had suspected it, known it deep down, but hearing the confirmation was like a knife twisting in my gut. "I can't believe this," I muttered, more to myself than to her. "All this time, you let me think we were building a life together, and all the while you were carrying another man's child." She looked up at me, her eyes pleading. "James, I was scared. I didn't know what to do. I thought maybe you wouldn't find out, that we could move past this, I said, my voice rising. How? How could we move past something like this? You've been lying to me for years, Claire. You've been living a double life, and you think we can just move past it?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I was wrong. I know that now. But please, James, don't leave me. We can fix this, we can make it work." I stood up, unable to sit there any longer, the anger and betrayal boiling over. "There's nothing left to fix, Claire. You destroyed everything. Our marriage, our trust, our future, there's nothing left." She reached for me, but I stepped back, shaking my head. "I'm done, Claire. I can't do this anymore. James, please," she cried, standing up and trying to follow me as I moved toward the door. "Please don't leave me. I'll do anything, whatever it takes, I'll do it. Just please don't go." I stopped, turning to face her one last time. The woman standing before me was a stranger, someone I no longer recognized. The love I had once felt for her was gone, replaced by a cold emptiness. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice firm. I'll be back for my things, but I'm not staying here. This is over. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. But I couldn't let myself care anymore. I couldn't afford to let her tears sway me. I had made my decision, and there was no turning back. As I walked out the door, the weight of what had just happened hit me like a ton of bricks. My marriage was over, my life as I knew it was shattered, and the woman I had once loved was now just a painful memory. But as I got into my car and drove away, I realized that this was only the beginning. The men who had been part of this betrayal weren't just going to walk away unscathed. They had played their part in destroying my life, and they would pay for it. I wasn't done yet. Weeks passed, and I moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. The divorce proceedings were swift and efficient, with Claire not contesting anything. She seemed broken, defeated, as if she had finally come to terms with the reality of what she had done. I didn't feel pity for her, only a numb sense of finality, as we signed the papers that ended our marriage. But the men, they hadn't gotten off so easily. I made sure of that. I gathered everything I had on them, every message, every detail, and sent it to their families, their employers, anyone who would listen. I didn't care about the fallout. They had destroyed my life, and I had no qualms about returning the favor. Matt lost his job, his wife leaving him in the process. Tom's reputation was ruined, and Luke disappeared, moving out of town as the truth of his affair with Claire spread like wildfire. And Ethan? He was the hardest to crack, but in the end, he too fell. The truth always finds a way out, no matter how deeply it's buried. As for Claire, I heard through the grapevine that she moved in with her parents, trying to piece her life back together. I didn't contact her, didn't want to hear from her. Our story was over, and I needed to move on. But even as I tried to rebuild my life, the scars remained. Trust was something I couldn't afford to give so freely anymore. The world had shown me its dark side, and I had stared back, unflinching. In the end, I had lost everything, but I had also found something. A truth about myself, about the world, and about the people we choose to trust. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was the one I had earned, and in a way, that was enough. Bye-bye.